Well, thanks for watching. Your views and comments make this video possible. And if you found value in any of our videos, please help me with a like and a comment to fuel our growth, our clout, and attract even more amazing guests like the one and only Charlie Papazian. Charlie, welcome and thank you for joining. This is just awesome. I got to know, what have you brewed lately?
Oh, thanks for inviting me. Be online with you. And yeah, what have I brew regularly, usually around 12 to 15 times a year. And lately I have an IPA in primary fermented. I just kegged a German style dunkel beer, dark beer, lager. And I have one, two, three, four beers on tap right now, and one of them's a English style pub ale.
Wow. That's quite a list. Well, I want to let everybody know, well, I think you need very little introduction. Please allow me just a moment to share what I would call some highlights that I know of about you. So, Charlie Papazian is truly an explorer, and he is a pioneering figure in the craft brewing community. He's renowned for sparking the home brewing revolution worldwide. He's the father of AHA, of the American Homebrewers Association, GABF, the Great American Beer Festival. He's the author of the best-selling book, The Complete Joy of Homebrewing. Charlie's legacy encompasses democratizing brewing, brewing knowledge, fostering a vibrant culture of innovation and community that we enjoy today. So, I mean, this is just awesome, Charlie, but you have had such an amazing career. I've got to know, how'd you start home brewing? Everybody's got their first home brewing story, but more importantly, how did you turn it into a career?
Well, I started home brewing, I think it was my fourth year, third year in college, university. I was going to the University of Virginia, and a neighbor dropped by. And long story short, then his neighbor was making homebrew, and it was brought up in a discussion. And myself and my two roommates' immediate reaction was, homebrew? You mean beer? I didn't know you could ever do anything like that. What is it? And my friend George Connor, who I attribute to my original connection to home brewing and good beer, and he ran a daycare center and a preschool about a few hundred yards from where our apartment was, and he was making old school, what we called Prohibition style homebrew, malt extract from a hop flavored malt extract from a can that you got in the supermarket, adding a lot of sugar and whatever yeast you could find. And we tried this beer. He said, "You want to try some homebrew? Let me go downstairs and get some good stuff." And he brought up maybe a year old bottle of homebrew. It was clear. It looked like beer. It was carbonated, and it was unlike anything that we ever tasted before. It was good enough to inspire our imagination. I recall it tasted a little bit cidery, but that didn't matter. It was certainly more interesting than the 69 cents a six pack, a cheap lager beer that we were enjoying as students. And we were on our way. The old timer, he gave me a 5-line recipe, and with that very basic information, we started making our own beer, and it was brewed in the cellar of the daycare center of my neighbor. Our apartment wasn't big enough, and this cellar had a coal-fired furnace too. So we were dealing with that, as well as a dirt floor, and lugging things from upstairs to downstairs, and fermenting our beer down in Charlottesville, Virginia. Um, the beers, the first couple of batches were undrinkable. And but with which is what is the nature of home brewing and home brewers is that we're persistent because we know that it's possible to make good beer. So I guess I started with that in mind, and I figured that instead of using cane sugar, I found that you could buy corn sugar from a local winemaking beer making supply store. This was back in 1970, 71, 70. And I also, they had little packages of yeast called ale yeast, dried ale yeast. And those two things made it enough of a difference that the beer was drinkable and inspired not only myself and my roommates to make more beer, but anybody who tried our homebrew was inspired to appreciate something other than mass marketed American light lager, and many of them started doing it themselves. That was the very beginning.
Your face just becomes so animated and smiling when you recall that. And so I'd love to know what you love the most about homebrewing and the impact that you've been able to see that those experiments and bad beers and good beers, what they've actually had on our world as we know it, because I've seen huge changes in my lifetime.
Well, let me set the scene a little bit. After I graduated from the University of Virginia, I moved out to Colorado, which where I still live in Boulder County. And back in the 70s, it was the stuff people discovered I knew how to make beer, and they asked me whether I was interested in teaching a course, and I said sure. And so I started teaching beer making out of my home. And we brewed every class and we drank beers from the previous classes. And the thing that inspired me the most was that the kind of people that showed up, it was equally men and women. Like I say, close to 50%. It was, and from people from all walks of life, and they were interested in this idea of making beer and discovering the world of beer. There wasn't very much information there. So what little information we each had as individuals, we had to share. And that's how we learned so much of our experience. And we brewed, generally speaking, we brewed beer that was inspiring enough to pursue the hobby and to keep trying and learning. But we had failures as well, obviously. And that was important. And it still is for any professional brewer to have failures every once in a while. It kind of puts you in your place, it humbles you, and it gives you a lot more respect for the whole idea that, you don't know it all and you're prone to mistakes, even in the best of times. And the thing that we did was we celebrated our mistakes. And, when I founded the American Home Brewers Association in 1978, it wasn't too far down the line that we even featured a cover story that we titled Bloopers, Homebrew Bloopers. And we celebrated and we laughed at the mistakes that we've made. Not so much exploding bottles, but, corks popping off carboys and spraying the ceiling and baby diapers being put into the fermenter rather than the baby diaper disposal container. And, there were all kinds of crazy, funny, humorous things that people ended up doing back in the day. And we laugh at each other's mistakes, and we learn from them. And it kind of set the stage for this whole idea of sharing and collaboration, and and to know that everybody's going to make mistakes, but you're always going to make uh, at least beer that's that you're going to enjoy. It may not be what you intended, but you'll enjoy what you made most of the time. Of course, there were some real fermentation disasters that you had to dump every once in a while. But boy, I think of some of the beers that I dumped back in those days that were sour that I could have saved in, in this day and age, sour beers, if done right, is in and is actually it's enjoyed. I enjoy it too if it's in balance and it's done well. But in those days, if there was any sour beer, there was, no one knew of any sour beer. We didn't even know about the Belgian beer culture and the lambics, and that wasn't until the early '80s that we discovered those kinds of beers. I mean, there wasn't much information available, so we were on our own.
Well, and I think that's the fascinating part. So many of us were on our own, and many craft breweries can trace their roots and homebrewing directly to your book. So how does it make you feel when you see the impact of writing that book and teaching those courses and putting out the Zymergy magazine, when you see these successful breweries? So, and maybe is there one short story you could share about one of those brewers or breweries that you feel like you may have put the spark in there that made it happen?
Um, One of the more infamous phrases that keeps popping up in my book and people attribute to me is, my phrase, relax, don't worry, have a hungry. And that pervades the attitude of my book and my approach to home brewing. Like we were talking just a little bit earlier about, you're going to make mistakes, but those mistakes are still going to turn out, usually pretty good beer. It might not be exactly the way you want. It might be a little bit too bitter, too dark, too sweet, whatever. But that relax, don't worry, have a home brew was really a unique attitude to have. There were a lot of the professional brewers at the time were very serious and conservative, and it was the big mega breweries ruled the culture um, in its entirety. And the relax, don't worry, have a home brew, have fun, enjoy your life, enjoy what you're doing was not to be taken seriously by the professional brewers at the time. I mean, yeah, it was all business. It was no fun, and that attitude was something that was special, and it wasn't adopted by everybody. There were some people that wouldn't even touch my book because it was too lighthearted, I guess. But those people soon found out that everybody else, the vast majority of people kind of enjoyed that approach, and eventually became part of the mainstream homebrewing beer culture um, that began in those days and continues today. Um, for the most part, that sense of adventure and exploration, you wouldn't do that unless you were having fun doing it. Because who wants to make mistakes? That was the attitude prior. And you kind of learn. Well, you learn from your mistakes, and you get to be a better brewer, and you you don't discover fantastic beer formulations and beers unless you kind of take those risks.
Well, and speaking of brewers that take a lot of risks, I know I was just with Sam Calagione, and that guy seems to be able to brew a beer with just about any ingredient. But we were talking, and he said he thought the craft beer revolution began with the opening of Sierra Nevada, which I thought was really profound. But I want to know, you were there before that. So when do you think the craft beer revolution really took hold?
Well, the word craft beer is used pretty loosely, and to me, craft beer is both homebrewed beer and professionally made beer, whether it's made by a larger or a small brewer, independent, or a home brewer. So, where did it start for me? I would say when I started uh, giving those homebrew classes, and the people that came there were the seeds of a community that grew tremendously. Several of those people that took my class ended up starting their own brewery. Boulder Brewing Company, which opened up a couple of months before Sierra Nevada. And me living here in Boulder County, that's the professional part of craft brewing. To me, that was real, and that had much more of an impact on my thinking as far as um, when everything really came together and started. Of course, there was the New Albion Brewery, there was DeBacher, there was Thousand Oak, there was a brewery in Michigan, the Real Ale Company. They were all starting up in those days. Sierra Nevada, William X. Newman Brewery in Albany, New York. They were popping up all about the same time within a couple of years. But the essence of craft brewing, I think, emerged in my living room as I taught beer classes. And there were beer distributors that would come to my classes. There were homebrew supply shop owners that would come to my classes. There were, as I said earlier, men and women would come. And that whole idea of of the whole idea of women enjoying beer, that was like, that was not part of the culture.
Oh, really?
They suffered anonymity of in the beer culture to our disadvantage because they had contributed a whole another way of thinking and appreciation for aspects of beer. Um, so there were chefs that came, there were politicians that came to my class. I mean, there were all kinds of things, local politicians, but they were all because they wanted to know what was going on. What was the big deal with home brewing? There were several stories that appeared in the local newspapers and on the network news about my class, even into times when it was still illegal. Because I started teaching those classes in 1973. And it wasn't until 1979 that it became legal. And people often think that I started the American Home Brewers Association with my partner, Charlie Matson. They think that we started because it became legal. Well, we had no intention. Well, we had no idea that it was a good home brewing was going to be legalized. We were going to we were going to start this organization, the American Home Brewers Association, on our own, despite the fact that homebrewing was illegal. So, the one didn't precipitate the other happening. It was totally independent at the time. And we just figured, the ATF, which was the predecessor to the TTB, the people who control alcohol laws and regulations, they had better things to do than busting homebrewers. But secretly, we were hoping we would get busted because it would do uh, tremendous, great things for popularizing the hobby at the time.
You told me one time in another conversation, you said we were rebels back then, and you loved that part of it, as I recall.
Yeah, we were rebels. I guess, we were revolutionaries. We were rebels. This day and age, you use different words like disruptors. That's a technical term these days, but it's all the same stuff. Um, and and Yeah, it was a struggle for us, in part, to get the ball rolling, because these guys from Boulder, Colorado, starting this organization and doing this homebrew thing in a lighthearted way, in an informative way, was, and very inviting to a lot of people. But to many people, we were, they figured we were a bunch of hippies smoking dope and relaxing and having a home brew and making crappy beer. That was just a myth. We were pretty serious about making this thing work, and we were, we lived in a culture that, by and large, that was um, pretty revolutionary in thought. But we were pretty serious about beer and brewing and wanting to learn, and it just eventually it caught on, but it wasn't an overnight success by any means.
Charlie, I know you yourself have interviewed many craft brewing legends. I know you worked on a movie. I've seen it for the Love of Craft, which I thought was fantastic. I know you told me you had many more interviews beyond just the ones in the movie. Could you share a little bit about one of the interviews that you did with these craft beer legends that was particularly meaningful to you?
Well, I interviewed about 150 of the pioneer founders of the early craft brewers, some of whom are still in business and still doing well, and others that um, failed. And there's a story to be told, whether they were successful or not. Um, but asking me to pick one out and share a story, I'll do better than that. I will share with you what those interviews meant to me. Um, I was interviewed as well, but it's not about me being interviewed. It was uh, organizing and spending a good solid hour face to face with 100. I I had a partner that was helping me with the interview, Dick Cantwell, who was formerly of Elysian Brewery. And he's gone on to other brewing endeavors, but he helped me as well. He was interviewing people on at other times. But I probably interviewed 100 front, pioneers, people who founded their own breweries, and I get to spend a good solid hour with them face to face, asking questions, the kinds of questions that I was trying to explore, their personality and why they did what they did, and the challenges that they had. Not necessarily the successes, although we did obviously talk about the successes, but what was their endeavor? What was their path like? And spending an hour was really unique to me. You'd think that, being, you know, having founded the association, and 40 years later, that I would have spent a lot of time with these people, but it was rare, because usually I would meet these people at meetings, conferences, at events, and the longest conversations I would have with anybody would be about a minute, because it was a group kind of dynamic, and people were always coming up and wanting to talk to the people that I was talking to, and they wanted to talk to me, and you never really got into the flow of the meaning of it all. And to me, it was mind blowing to have interviewed all these people and spending a good solid hour asking them questions, some questions that I had teed up. I really didn't give them the questions ahead of time, because I really wanted them to talk whatever came to their mind. And the flow was fantastic. I mean, you were listening, you were reacting to what they were saying, yet you were trying to remember what questions you really wanted to ask. You were involved with the technical aspects of the sounds and the sights and the setup. It was a lot of moving parts. And I can tell you that after each day, I usually did 5 to 6 interviews a day for 2 straight days in a row. That was my thing. Then a month later, I would get another group of 6 to 8 people come to Boulder or to where we were shooting the location, and it was exhausting. I was exhausted at night. It was, I couldn't get to sleep because there were so many thoughts in my mind and so many new experiences that I was having, and learning things that I never knew about before. You know, uh, some of the highlight that I can recall are people like Ted Marty of August Shell, Jim Cook, Ken Grossman, Jeff and Marcy Larson from Anchor Brewing, or from Alaskan Brewing. I didn't get to interview Fritz Maytag, but I've watched his interview several times, from the Anchor Brewing. There were people such as Dave Grinnell, who's the brewmaster, um, first brewmaster for Jim Cook and Boston Beer. And one of the things I'll never forget was, how did he connect with brewing and how did he get that job? He said he didn't know what he was doing with his life at the time. We were living in New York City, and there was a small classified advertisement in the Village Voice. And it was Jim Cook asked, he was starting up his brewing company, Boston Beer Company, and he said he was looking for a brewmaster. And it was like a 2 or 3 line classified ad. And he ended up being the vice president of brewing operations for all of Boston Beer before he retired a few years ago. There, just so many behind the scenes stories, of successes, failures, and above all, the amazing challenges that these people had, men and women, that, in this day and age, people talked about the challenges and the struggles and, the trends and stuff. But back in those days, it was more than just struggles. It was like impossibilities that people were trying to overcome. And so I think that the issues that people have these days pale compared to what was on the menu regarding the challenges that the early pioneers had. I mean, banks wouldn't talk to you, distributors wouldn't talk to you, retailers didn't have a clue what you were doing, consumers weren't interested, and when they did try your beer, they were saying it was too bitter, um, and it was, and the regulations were impossible. It was just everything was stacked against you. Yet these people persisted and did what they did, and they succeeded. So many of them succeeded despite the immense odds, the impossibilities of success. Nobody was willing to give them a hand. Even the brewers, there was a brewers association for small brewers at the time, and their standard reply when craft brewers would call them was, "Oh, you want to start a small brewery? Go ask God," and they would hang up. And I mean, it was really tough. It was really tough. So that's my take on, the highlights and what those interviews meant to me. And I hope someday that those interviews will be accessible. I know that there was a plan and a budget and such for those to be made accessible, but COVID happened and that scrambled the whole process. But still in limbo, I guess, because it's
Well, I know the movie "The For the Love of Craft," which I think had just 2 or 3 of your interviews, was fantastic. Well, let's switch gears a little bit because you talked about those challenges, and there's a lot of challenges going on in the industry right now. Breweries closing, a lot of just bad news. But I know you have a way of, I don't know, it's always encouraging every time I talk to you, Charlie. So are there some things you've heard or seen or talked to that are just actually encouraging about today's brewing environment?
Well, those bad news snippets you always see in the headlines and such are, they are just such a sliver of reality. Um, those headlines are made by people who make money by getting people to read their stuff. And the more dramatic you make the headlines, the more people click on the link, so to speak. But what's encouraging to me is that, for every one bad headline or one story that appears that things are in the toilet, there's there for every one of those, there's a million beer drinkers every day asking for a craft beer and celebrating by simply enjoying that craft beer made by a craft brewer or a home brewer. I mean, I I for one am one of those people. And whether there's several options in this around where I live, and I just so much appreciate it. And all the people that are there are appreciating it so much that, yeah, sure, there are people that go out of business, and there are challenges, whether they're supply chain challenges, government regulation challenges, cultural challenges, uh, but there are what, 9,000 plus craft breweries in the United States. There are more opening than there are closing. And the ones we hear about the most that are struggling are the what we call the regional craft brewers, the bigger ones. If you're in the distribution business, you're in a network that's very entangled, and you need to be on top of your game every single day in order to make your business work within that environment. But and people are succeeding. Some are, some don't. Um, some make mistakes. Some can recover from those mistakes, and some can't. Um, but you know, just to give you a snapshot of what it was like back in the '80s, a half barrel of beer, a keg of beer, a half barrel, 15 and a half gallons of beer. When you bought it at the store, it would cost you about $30. You know, times two is $60. So basically, beer was retailing for $60 a barrel. And no one ever dreamed or imagined in their wildest dreams that people could brew beer and basically sell at retail for thousands of dollars a barrel. That was never discussed. That was never imagined. That was never in the vision of anyone at the time. But that factor just by itself is one reason that indicates that people value the value of beer is very high compared to what the value of beer, how it was perceived 30, 40 years ago. And so that has a lot going. That's a big driver of, the positive end of things. And there's a lot of good stuff happening out there still. Yeah, sure. There have been many cycles. Homebrewing activity has cycled up and down several times over the 40 years I was when I was with the Brewers Association. And craft brewers, there was never a down year as far as numbers. COVID kind of threw a wrench into that whole scenario, but once things stabilize again, there have been some flat years, but uh, there's always seems to be a little bit of growth that kind of eventually comes back. So, what?
Well, you did literally say you thought business conditions now pale in comparison to what they were in the 80s. But the other aspect is, look how many people enjoy craft beer. And we need to embrace that fact and then just adjust to business conditions. Is that close?
That's very accurate. And to give you a small snippet, a story of the beer festival, Great American Beer Festival back in the days, there were people, small breweries, tiny breweries, that were coming to the Great American Beer Festival in Colorado. They may have been from Michigan or Vermont or Florida or Arkansas or California, and they were never going to sell their beer out of their county. But they would come to the beer festival, contribute their beer, and be there because they got inspired by what could be and the energy that was there, whether it was the energy of the brewers, the collaboration and the sharing of knowledge, or just the excitement that the beer drinkers had being in the room with so many cool beers and interesting beers and meeting the brewers. People basically, um, you know, came to the beer festival for positive energy to take back because it was so oppressive back home. Whether it was Arkansas or North Carolina or wherever they were, it was like a struggle. Nobody would listen to them. No one would appreciate them. Nobody, I mean, they were on their own. Um, and the fact that there was a vision of what could be by coming to the beer festival and seeing the origins of emerging beer culture here in Colorado really inspired a lot of people. So that's kind of what drove people to continue.
Well, and GABF will be coming up, and HomebrewCon will be associated again. So I'm looking forward to that. Well, Charlie, let's transition to the rapid fire questions. These are just short answers right off the top of your head. Uh, when I say or I mention, what is one of your most favorite moments in homebrewing? Did you have one that comes to mind?
Oh God, in my life, I had so many great moments. It's maybe meeting Michael Jackson for the first time. That was at one of the early Homebrewers Association meetings. He was a legend in his time, and he helped inspire us as we helped inspire other people. So meeting Michael Jackson was one of the highlights.
That's a, that's a pretty good highlight. I think the last time we met in person, you had told me that the Smithsonian Institute had stolen your spoon. Now, tell me, did you replace the spoon, and have any other gadgets that you really can appreciate in this day and age that you kind of upgraded your setup with?
Um, yes, I had plenty of spoons to go to after gave away my original, the spoon that so many hundreds and hundreds of people used to stir those brew pots back in the day when I was teaching beer classes. That was the magic of the spoon that I gave to the Smithsonian. The paddles and the spoons I have three different. When I brew a batch of beer, I have three different paddles and spoons depending on what I'm doing, whether I'm stirring the mash, stirring the wort, or trying to keep things sterile or sanitized. So yeah, that was a good one. That was the spoon.
So,
The stuff.
so is there a gadget though that you've upgraded that you feel like this is a big improvement?
My most recent upgrade was buying a long wire handled brush that I could clean out my hoses with, my long hoses. I discovered, you can get brushes with long handles on them as a home brewer and different sizes of them. And you can find anything these days on Amazon or at your local hardware store for that matter. But no, my philosophy has been keeping things simple. My advice to home brewers: if you really enjoy what you're doing, don't get so over your head and contraptions and gadgets and technology that it becomes a chore and you don't brew as much. I've seen this happen to so many people. They get so sophisticated, which is fine, but what I've seen is people get sophisticated with their equipment, and it takes so much to set up and then clean afterwards and maintain that you're spending much more time doing stuff that's not brewing. And I keep things simple, and my system is still the same system I had 30 years ago.
Well, I had heard that, but I had to check to see if there was a new Charlie Papazian approved brewing gadget.
No, it just every once in a while I'll replace a hose here and there, get a new paddle or a spoon, but um, same fermenters. Uh, replace my fermentation locks every once in a while. They get kind of cloudy after a while, after 10 years.
Charlie, you just again get so animated when we go through these stories. Is there one particular moment or contribution you're most proud of in home and craft brewing?
I think the the legacy that left behind of the collaboration, sharing, and which manifests itself in a professional brewer having an open door for other brewers to come and visit and see what they're doing and learn from each other. I think that legacy is a big paradigm shift that happened because we as home brewers had to share because we had no choice in the beginning. That's what we learned from each other. And that has persisted even today. The idea of breweries collaborating to make different beers. Back in the day, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, my goodness, people were so secretive with their recipe and their, what they used as a doorstop or, what malt they were using or hops or yeast. And now people, you have a problem, you give the local brewery a call, you get you get a backup yeast, or, you need this hop or that, people collaborate. And that didn't exist. That didn't exist not only in brewing, but it doesn't exist in the world of competition. And we've seen that extend itself. The communication between brewers and suppliers of ingredients and the manufacturers of equipment or the growers of malt and hop, that collaboration and that network of communication was never there before. And now you see it in the food industry, and a little bit more. We started it as home brewers. We started that idea, and it was acceptable, accepted, and people saw that it made for a better business environment.
That really is huge. And it's one of the things that draws me to the industry. Well, you mentioned when you started, things were illegal, and nothing had been approved by the government. But I think I read that Tennessee has recently allowed home distilling. What do you think about the legalization of home distilling?
Well, I thought it's interesting to me. I remember hanging out with a home distiller in the Netherlands, and this guy helped legalize home distilling in the Netherlands in Europe. And there were some exciting things that were happening and more creativity. Um, the process of home distilling there are similarities to making beer, but once you start separating the alcohol from the liquid, that's a whole other ball game. And you're getting into areas that are very, very unique. But but it's a hobby, and for a home distillers and distillery, like if that trend of legalization continues, there'll probably be a lot more imagination and creativity and exploration of what could be in the world of distilling, because the smallest producers that usually come up with the first ideas of doing something different and successfully.
Well, that actually is very encouraging. Won't that be fun? I hope the trend continues. Well, Charlie, as we wrap up on these rapid fire questions, this ought to be an easy one for you. I want to know what recipe you have brewed the most, and will you share it with the audience?
Well, the recipe, I mean, I have a lot of beers that I make consistently, but the one that is probably, well, I've just made the 41st batch of it, which is, I make it twice a year. So I've been doing it for over 20 years. It's an English style ordinary bitter that was inspired by some real ale that I had in England, and better than sharing on. I mean, it's been in Zymergy magazine. That recipe's been in Zymergy magazine, and it's also been it's in my, at least, the Complete Joy of Home Brewing. It's certainly in there, and in the last two editions, whether number 3 or number 4 was the most recent. So it's been shared many times, and it's accessible. But boy, it's a delicious beer, and it's maybe, I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but it's obviously I like it a lot because I make it a lot. Where the lower alcohol and the session beer, it's accessible. Ordinary bitter, Charlie Papazian or ordinary bitter, you might be able to do a search engine search with that, and it will be posted somewhere.
I will find it. As an AHA member, I should have access to it. So I will look in one of those early issues of Zymergy. Well, I love an English bitter, so I am going to, and I'll probably brew it myself. Charlie, I just wanted to thank you. It's always encouraging and fun to see you. I've run into you at judgings and GABF. Hope to see you maybe sometime this summer, or at least at GABF. And thank you so much for joining us. This is fantastic. And I want to thank our audience for joining. And I want to hear your thoughts on Charlie and his own home brewing and the influence he's had on you in the comments below. Just type them in there, and maybe we can get Charlie to even reply to 1 or 2 of them. So I also want you to check out these videos that are on screen, because they have been picked out just for you. So, Charlie, thank you so much. This was fantastic. Cheers.
Cheers.